are staring at me kind of like it's yours now. So today is the theme is no complaints. And I don't know when the last time you experienced a day without complaints. But for many of us, it's maybe been a long time. And one of the things that we can learn from this church in Smyrna is that when Jesus addresses this church through the Apostle John, the one thing that he does not do is he does not list a complaint. Now, out of the 7 churches, only 2 of them receive that honor. And one is the church in Philadelphia, and the other one is this one, the church in Smyrna. So, no complaint is listed. What we have are encouragements and blessings, and then all the other letters to the 5 other churches, there is a complaint listed from God. But in this one, there is no complaint. So today, if we're at Smyrna, we're going to move up the coast. You want to put that slide up there? We're going to move up the coast about 50 miles and about 80 kilometers, or clicks as they say. So you see, Ephesus was the first church, and that's right on the coastline there. Smyrna is the second church. That is also on the coastline, the Adriatic Sea there. And then next week we'll take a look at Pergamum, which is also on the coast. Then the others are all inland. But these are all in the region of Anatolia. This is Turkey. And it is known in the Bible as Asia. We know it as Asia, Asia Minor. And this is the region that these cities exist. So Smyrna is today known as Izmir, I-Z-M-I-R. Today it's known as Izmir, and Izmir is actually just the Turkish translation of Smyrna. So Smyrna is the Greek name. It was a Greek identity for years and years. A lot of Greeks had lived there, and in the early 20th century, it was repopulated with Turks, and so they decided to adopt a Turkish name, and so it became Izmir. Today it's a city of about 3 million people. It's very wealthy, prominent seaport harbor, surrounded, like Ephesus, with a lot of fertile agricultural land. So it is about 3,000 years old. How old is this building? 30, something like that, 30 years old, just about. Can you imagine 3,000 years old? That's how far back this city goes. And so in this city of Smyrna, they had built a temple. It became a Roman colony, a Roman city, in 195 BC, before Christ, 195. And to commemorate their becoming a Roman city, they built this temple. The temple would have been a place of worship for the imperial cult, the gods of the Roman Empire. Some of those gods would have included some of the leaders, like the Caesars. And so it was a very Roman city. They were steadfast in their support of Rome. And it was what we would consider a pagan city. And pagan meaning that they worshiped many different gods. And that was really a sign of your advancement as a Roman city, was that you could not even tolerate, but you could actually desire to worship a whole pantheon of gods. The more gods, the merrier, apparently. There was a significant, you had the Romans, you had the Greeks that were living there. There was was also a significant Jewish presence. And then there was a growing Christian community. This is one of the early spots. We think Paul probably established this church on his missionary journey in through this region. And so it had a pretty early start, probably in the 50s, as a Christian community. And it was well known. It was considered a very prominent city. As a matter of fact, Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum used to all kind of compete to be known as the first city. Smyrna often saw itself as the first city, the most important city of those three port cities. And so I don't think that it's a mistake that when John the Apostle receives this word from God, this is how it begins. Write this letter to the angel, to the pastor, the head of the church in Smyrna. This is the message from the one who is the first and the last. This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, who is dead but is now alive. God is making a point. You can all call yourselves first, but there is only one first. And the one who is first was also the last. The one who is victorious also died on the cross. And so I love that beginning to this letter because it reminds us of the importance of the identity of the church. So a reminder here that Jesus is the first and the last, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, and John repeats that theme throughout this book of Revelation. Now, the church at Smyrna had its unique qualities as a church. From the earliest development of the Christian church, it was home to not only an early church, but a bishopric. Now, what is a bishopric? So a bishopric would have been a location, a geographical place where there resided a bishop who presided over that city or over that region. So from the early days of the early church, it was a bishopric. And it later, within a generation or two after the time of Jesus, within a couple generations, it had become also a metropolitan see. That's not an ocean sea, that's a visual sea. And that was one of the terms that they used in early church ecclesiastical history to describe the Holy See. Do you remember Rome being referred to as the Holy See? So then the metropolitans would be like these sub-seas underneath the Roman See. It was not a wealthy church. It may have been wealthy in the beginning, but at this point, it is not a wealthy church. And there is an assumption that many lost their wealth because of their faith in Jesus. They were undergoing significant suffering, and some were even facing potential imprisonment because of their faith. Some of the counterparts, some of the Jews from a local synagogue, were hostile towards these Christians, which kind of sets up some of the discord that we read about in this particular letter. I believe what Jesus wants you to know from this letter here is that he knows your suffering and he knows your struggles. He knows them, and he is aware of them, and he hears you. So when we think about this, Jesus is identifying with you and your suffering, and he is calling you to remain faithful. because when we remain faithful, we will receive the crown of life. Jesus knows what you're going through. He always has. And he always will know. And your suffering is not a solitary suffering. Because when you suffer, Christ suffers with you. And ideally, the church suffers with you. Suffering has often described the church of Jesus Christ. And we have a wonderful example in one of the very earliest leaders of the early church, the leader of the bishopric here in Smyrna, and then later, when it becomes the Metropolitan See, is a man named Polycarp. And I try to make a joke about this in my e-weekly. Polycarp is not a three-headed carp. Polycarp was his name. He was a Christian. And why is this man so important? Well, he had a long tenure as first as presbyter and then as bishop of the bishopric and then of the see, the Metropolitan. And eventually, we think about at the age of 86, he ended up being put to death for his faith. The Roman authorities gave him an out. They said, "We don't need to do this to you. All you need to do is to renounce your faith in Jesus Christ." And he did not. He could not. And so they put him to death. They burned him at the stake, and that didn't kill him. So then they stabbed him. They said he bled so much that it put the fire out. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's one of the reports. So why is this guy so important, besides his martyrdom? Polycarp was a student of John the Apostle. Remember James and John, the disciples? You know, little John, the younger brother, the beloved disciple. So John the Apostle is relocated to Ephesus after Jesus' death. And he builds the church in Ephesus. And one of his students in Ephesus is a young lad named Polycarp. And John teaches him, he and one other student. The other student ends up not remaining faithful to Jesus, but Polycarp does. And he teaches Polycarp everything that he knew about Jesus. And so Polycarp becomes the pastor and then the bishop of this place called Smyrna. There were probably three, what we'd call today, apostolic fathers of the early church in that late first century that were instrumental in forming the identity of the Christian church. Polycarp is one of those three. The other two people mentioned, one is Clement of Rome, and the other one is Ignatius of Antioch. So you have these three cities in this region, this Mediterranean region, that are really, by the end of the first century, the powerhouses of the early church. Antioch, which is in northern Syria. Then you have Smyrna, where we're at, on the coast of Turkey. And then across the sea, you have Rome in Italy. So those are the three primary centers of Christian thought at the end of the first century. Polycarp corresponded often with Ignatius, the leader of the church in Antioch. And Antioch is a place that's where Paul went to study, to study Christianity. Antioch was a place from the early church after the martyrdom of Stephen, that's where a lot of the Christians moved to. And so these three early church fathers were important because they're the ones that learned from the apostles themselves, and they could authenticate the teachings of Jesus. See, this is a couple of generations after Jesus now. How do you know what Jesus said? You know it because of these witnesses who studied under the apostles. Now, a side note on this letter, I asked last week, do you think it was written to a particular person, to the pastor, or was it written to the congregation? Well, there's some scholars that believe this letter was written in particular to Polycarp. And the evidence on that is quite strong. And so this particular letter was probably written to Polycarp so that he could express it to all the Christians in his region, the region of Smyrna, where they were experiencing a lot of denunciation, where they were being outed by some of their colleagues and friends. So whether you believe it's to Polycarp or not, or whether it's to the whole church, it still carries an important message about the suffering that we experience as Christians. Now, the city Smyrna was a wealthy city, and this is basically what Jesus says about it. By the standards of a wealthy city, the church Smyrna is very poor. Yet in the eyes of Jesus, their faith makes them very rich. So how do we measure our wealth? Is it by our bank accounts, or is it by our faith? Jesus said to them, I know about your suffering, and I know your poverty. Jesus knew them, and he knew that they experienced this suffering by some of their friends and maybe even family. Not all, but some that were members of a particular synagogue. And because of that, they were turned in to Roman authorities, being accused of worshiping someone above Caesar, someone above the imperial court. And that they were actually denouncing all the other gods. They were saying there was only one God. And in a city where you're supposed to have multiple gods, that's a problem. I remember, some of you know that I traveled into East Germany a couple times on mission trips when I was a young pastor. And I remember several years after the wall had fallen and reading a report that just broke my heart. It was a story of how the East German state police, the Stasi, that was headed up by my dear friend Vladimir Putin at the time. I'm being facetious in case you're wondering. And one of the things that was uncovered was that he actually coerced, threatened, and bribed pastors of churches to report on their congregational members. Many of these people were turned in out of threat, like they maybe knew something about the pastor or his family that they were going to expose. And so these pastors would report on people from within their congregation. It broke my heart because I thought back to that and I was thinking, I wonder if I knew any of those pastors, because I met quite a few. And then what was even more hurtful was the realization that more likely I knew some of the people that had they've been turned in and sent to prison, to the Siberian prison camps, because that's where they sent them. I remember how devastated I was. So being denounced is not a trivial matter. Being denounced by friends, families, by trusted people is a great threat to the followers of Jesus. And I know we don't really have that experience here today, but we have had that experience in the history of our church. If you go back to East Germany, if you go back to other places, if you go back to the early church, there are times in history where the church has experienced excruciating suffering because of their faith. Today, India is probably one of the most dangerous places for Christians to be. Patty and I were at a meeting last fall where we learned about the persecution of Christians, especially in central India and northern India. And it's awful. So even though we may not experience that kind of suffering, there are Christians around the world who this day do experience that suffering. Confessing Jesus as God would have been considered blasphemous to some of the Jews. And so they turned in their neighbors, their friends. As their faith in Jesus may have interrupted some of the business deals. See, that would be one of the reasons why you get turned in. If you're messing up the economy, you could go to prison for that. Some of you are looking at me like you don't believe me. This is an earlier story from Paul, one of his missionary journeys. Paul and Silas traveled through the towns of Amphipolis and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogue service, and for 3 Sabbaths in a row he used the scriptures to reason with the people. He explained the prophecies and proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. He said, "This Jesus I'm telling you about is the Messiah." Some of the Jews who listened were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with many God-fearing Greek men and quite a few prominent women. But some of the Jews were jealous, so they gathered some troublemakers from the marketplace to form a mob and start a riot. They attacked the home of Jason, searching for Paul and Silas so they could drag him out to the crowd. Not finding them there, they dragged out Jason and some of the other believers instead and took them by the city council. Paul and Silas have caused trouble all over the world, they shouted, and now they're here disturbing our city too. And Jason has welcomed them into his home. They are guilty of treason against Caesar, for they profess allegiance to another king named Jesus. So there's other stories of where idol makers lose their business because Jesus becomes such an important part of the Christian identity of a community, that there's no longer a market for idols and gods for you to take home for your dresser. These denunciations led to suffering for Christians by the Roman authorities. So not only were the Jews denouncing Christians, but they were also working with the Roman authorities to have them arrested and imprisoned. So not only did Christians suffer, but some also were tempted to denounce Jesus in order to prevent their financial loss. John calls this group of Jews who have done great harm to the church a synagogue of Satan. Now let's be careful here. These polemics are reserved for a few members in Smyrna and in Philadelphia. They cannot be extended to other Jews. So what is the meaning behind this? Well, Satan was considered the accuser. That was another name for Satan. The accuser. And some members of the synagogue accused Christians of infidelity to Caesar. So that's the identity of the accuser. The other name that Satan was known for was the deceiver, who spread falsehoods to accomplish his purposes. And so oftentimes, some of these people would share falsehoods about the Christians in order to get them into trouble. Now, just so we can understand that it was an equal opportunity polemic, the Romans are also included. It says in verse 10, "It is the devil who will put the faithful in prison." So who are the Romans? The ones who are making these decisions about the Christians? They're devils. Now in Smyrna, threatening Christians with death is the devil's work. So for Christians, they saw Rome as a representative of the devil. The people may face prison now, but what they were learning was that in the end, they will be free. And Satan will be in chains. A little bit later on in Revelation chapter 12, we hear this. Then there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, representative of Satan, and his angels. And the dragon lost the battle, and he and his angels were forced out of heaven. This great dragon, the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, the one deceiving the world, was thrown down to the earth with all his angels. So the Christians, what they're being told, what they're hearing from Polycarp and from John, if he was still there, what they're hearing from them is that you may face some imprisonment now, but in the end, because of Jesus Christ, you will be free. So you may be suffering now, but you will experience freedom. And in the end, Satan, the one who has caused the deception, the one who has created the accusations, Satan will be in chains. He will be imprisoned. He will not be free. I know this is some heavy stuff here. But suffering is heavy stuff. When you go through life and you experience times of struggle and pain and suffering, it can feel incomprehensible. And so the purpose of this particular letter is not to complain to you, the church in Smyrna. The purpose of this letter is to call you to faithfulness. Remain faithful. Remain faithful. One of the things that I have experienced when I have gone through periods of suffering is that I am so grateful that I have this perspective. I think it was given to me by my parents and my grandparents. But the perspective that I have is that this is not the end. That this suffering that I am experiencing now will not consume me. some point in my life, I will be free. You see, suffering is not defeat. I think a lot of the world sees, well, you're suffering, you're a failure, you're nothing. Suffering is not defeat. Suffering is an experience of humanity. And suffering is an opportunity to demonstrate that there is more to our humanness than just this earth. Suffering is an opportunity for us to look towards heaven, to be faithful to God. You see, that's what Jesus is saying about being victorious. Victory over suffering is in one's faithfulness to God. Polycarp never overcame his suffering. I mean, not only did they burn him at the stake, when he didn't die, they stabbed him with a spear. And so his suffering never ended until his life ended. But he was victorious. And his victory comes because he remained faithful even in the midst of his suffering. You know, the Greeks had this tradition of putting a laurel wreath upon the head of the victor. It was usually branches and vines and maybe some flowers. If you were victorious in military battles, you got to wear one of the laurel wreaths. If you were victorious in an athletic event, you got to wear one of the wreaths. In this letter, it talks about a crown, like that wreath. Your reward is the victory wreath, the crown of life. The victory wreath that you will receive for persevering will not come from the authorities. It will not come from the government. The victory wreath that you will receive will come from God. And it is the crown of life, the crown of life eternal. No complaints. No complaints for you, church. But in the midst of your suffering, I call you to be faithful.